After the election, and it's titled Now What? Can you all hear? Yes. So a couple of prefatory notes. First, I'm delighted to be here. I've been doing all kinds of speaking gigs recently, and you're my favorite group, so I'm glad to be home. Second, if you didn't turn on the news this morning, the big news of the morning is that Brad Pitt and Jolie are separating. So that's the serious news this morning. Some of you were here this June, I think it was, when I talked about Brexit, and I'm not going to repeat all of that, but actually I'm going to start taking off from that, because if you recall, one of the things I mentioned at the time was that Brexit was in many ways much more serious than UK leaving or possibly leaving Europe, because in a way it called into question the whole post-World War II enterprise in Europe and internationally. And you might have noticed that we are living in what could modestly be called an incredibly fragile world. And it's a world in which we made assumptions after the Second World War that are coming unraveled very quickly. And I would argue that what's going on in the world is probably the most serious stuff since the end of the Second World War. And none of us know exactly where it's all going to wind up and where it's all going. The American election is in many ways, of course, centerpiece for us, but in many ways it's also symptomatic of what's going on in the rest of the world. And it's super serious. I mean, after the end of the Cold War, Americans in particular jollied themselves in the belief that the US had won the Cold War. And if you dug into that, what the arguments really were was that capitalism had won over socialism, and that liberal democracy had won over fascism, communism, whatever, the isms of various kinds. And we've been making that assumption now for all these decades. Parallel to these assumptions came the technological changes and so-called globalization. And globalization has many components to it, and I'm not going to spend the hour talking about it, but one of the aspects of globalization was the idea that this was actually a good thing and was going to be welcomed by everybody. Because one of the assumptions at the end of the Second World War, and why you had the EU and all these international institutions, were that nationalism and parochialism and xenophobia and so forth could be overcome by setting up a structure internationally which would undermine nationalism, sovereignty, and all those good things. And if we would only cooperate across national boundaries, we would get enmeshed technologically, economically, people would get enmeshed with each other. It would, in a sense, offer a protective armor against the kinds of wars of nationalism and so forth that had been taking place in the 19th and 20th century, right? So we also imagined that setting up a structure of global governance, as it's called in the technical sense, was a kind of inoculation against the repetition of earlier things. And then on top of setting up global governance, not just the United Nations, but the EU and tons of various organizations and an alphabet soup of organizations, most of which, you know, if you read in the paper, you're saying, well, what is that anyway? But in any event, an alphabet soup, and furthermore, all the various countries in the world joining subgroups of these organizations so that they would be working with other people collectively and so forth to produce a better world. The other change that happened in the interim between the end of the Second World War and now was, and that I did mention last time, was at the end of the Second World there were only 50-odd countries, and we now have more or less 200 countries, right? So it was not just global governance and enmeshing countries, but enmeshing them as they became sovereign. And the idea was that as soon as they would start interacting with countries, would join these organizations and so forth, they would also see the wisdom of working across borders, not being as nationalistic and so forth. I keep saying so forth, I don't know why. So that was the kind of mindset politically and economically, and on top of that then came the technological changes, right? We're all, within 2 seconds we know that Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie are going to divorce. Within 3 seconds we know that a convoy was attacked somewhere and so forth. Just think back to our early years, so you're all, almost all of us, old enough. I mean, it took a long time for news to reach us. I mean, the New York Times several days later might have an article of something that happened somewhere else. Now we are bombarded with it, we know it instantly, and so that that's a two-edged sword in a sense. On the one hand, we're living in this interconnected information age, also interconnected technological age, with far more actors, not just countries and states, but organizations, corporations, all kinds of different units, non-governmental organizations, and it's a maze out there. And the normal citizen, whether he or she lives in the United States or in England or somewhere else, finds it hard to grasp all of that. I mean, you're all well informed and you follow the news, and yet I could throw at you acronyms galore. You would have no idea what they are, what they do, why they exist, and your governments and people like me say, oh, they're really important, you know, they're the central part of the modern world. And you say, I live in Santa Cruz, does any of this affect me? You know? So that has been bubbling up. A second kind of track along these lines is that we in the United States, but also in all the other industrial countries, are beginning to feel that things are happening to us that we don't have control over, right? The loss of control. We all kind of feel it. The loss of control of the wars out there, the loss of control of the economy. Economists get out there and they say, well, this is understandable for the following reason, but it all seems kind of detached. And we're beginning to develop a kind of visceral hostility to all of that stuff. I mean, we in Santa Cruz really don't like it when Sacramento tells Santa Cruz what it ought to do. And California doesn't like it when Washington tells us what to do. And Washington doesn't like it when Congress checkmates the executive. And the executive and Congress don't like it that the Supreme Court can checkmate it. So everybody seems to be checkmating everybody else, and we just want to be left alone. We just don't want to hear about it. We just somehow are sick and tired of it. And furthermore, and I think this is true of everybody in this room, we're all sort of muddling through, but we're imagining things could be better, and we're certainly worried about our children and grandchildren, right? So I'm just trying to sketch here the mindset that we, the educated folks of Santa Cruz, have. Now imagine what people who don't understand any of the global governance aspects, don't see any of the advantages, see themselves unemployed, semi-employed, using drugs, feel about it. And then add the next layer, which is we lived in our nice little communities, a lot of them fairly homogeneous. In the last few decades, we've had to put up with people moving in, like African Americans moving in, Hispanics moving in. You know, Hispanics, they don't even speak English. Who are they anyway? And on top of that, you now have people moving in who wear headgear, who are Muslims. We ourselves may not necessarily be religious, we might even be very secular, but these people are strange, they seem to be very religious. What are they doing anyway? You know, the west side of Santa Cruz is changing. Actually it's not, but let's imagine. It's changing because lots of students are moving in, but it's not. But there is this sort of visceral sense that the rug is being pulled out from under people. And that visceral sense is evident everywhere around the world. Everywhere, in one fashion or another. And again, without repeating the whole Brexit discussion, there are essentially no West European countries that now don't have a chunk of the population who deeply resents what is happening to us. Right? Don't take any necessarily individual responsibility, but things are happening to us. Strange people are moving in. We used to be a homogeneous society. You know, look at England, look at Holland, look at Germany. All these strangers are arriving. What's going on anyway? And by the way, all the various things that I mentioned at the beginning don't have to be true. For example, you could be living in let's say in Sweden, a nice, liberal, social democratic country, where the ideology is social democracy, where people are living well, where you don't have, you know, on the street people that we have. Poverty is not remedied, but in any event is attended to by the government and so forth. But Sweden was a nice homogeneous country. And now all of these strange people have moved in. They haven't, by and large, done anything terrible, but it makes me feel uncomfortable. My neighbors now, you know, they wear strange clothing, they have strange smelling odors, foods coming out of, they cook with strange things. It all feels kind of eerie. And Sweden is actually a good example that I've given you before, which is if we took in as many, we in the United States took in as many refugees as Sweden has, we would, per capita, we would have had to taken in 5 million people. And we're arguing about whether 100,000, you know, will do us in. So this, even in Sweden, you now have a small percentage of the population saying, we don't want this, we want our Swedish identity, we don't want these strangers. Yes, we've given charity all over the world, but you know, this is not, the world is taking away our, you know, our birthright, our country, whatever. Now, you move from Sweden and you move into France, you move into Britain, you move into Germany, and right-wing parties, your Trumps of this world, are everywhere gaining momentum. And they're gaining momentum in elections, 2 recent German elections in Berlin, and as a matter of fact, in the state where Merkel comes from, the right-wing alternative party has won the largest percentage of votes. Marine Le Pen in France may very well do very well in the next election. And even if she doesn't, the very right of center, Sarkozy, who has been in office before, may very well come back, and he too is anti-globalization, anti-climate change legislation, anti-immigrants, and so forth. So even a mainstream parties, in some of them, are electing fairly right-wing people who are all railing against it. Why are they all railing against it? Well, personally, they may in fact be prejudiced or racist or whatever, but they're also sensing that there is popular support for their position. Months ago, most of you probably sat around and said, oh, well, Trump is not going to get anywhere, right? Well, Trump is getting somewhere. And the worst part of it is that people who support these individuals, people who are railing against, you know, globalization, trade, all those foreign elements that are mucking up my lives, as they feel, very often don't have a clue as to what they're talking about. You will recall that when, after Brexit was passed, the most searched for item on the internet was, what is the EU? Because the people that voted against getting out of the EU were by and large clueless as to what the EU was doing. And in many of the cities, I know I'm repeating myself, but some of you weren't here, last time, some of the communities where people in the very great majority voted for Brexit and said, you know, we're poor and we're having these foreigners move in and we want to have, you know, control, were the communities that benefited from the EU money. EU money was supporting their hospitals and their schools, and EU economic sharing of economic stuff helped factories in those towns and so forth. So people were actually voting against their own interests. And people in this country may very well vote against their interests, right? So what I'm saying is, in a sense, that the world, and we can discuss some of these things in more detail, the world is incredibly fragile right now. There is a huge crisis in Western liberal democracy. And part of the concern about democracy is how you define it. That is to say, democracy in the post-World War period was in democratization at the state level and internationally. Okay. The first criticism came that the international democratization, like through the UN, like the EU, wasn't in fact democracy for the grassroots. These were bureaucrats, sometimes elected officials in the European Parliament, but I, as an individual living in Santa Cruz, had no say. And so I didn't feel that I was participating in a democratic aspect. Okay. And as things went more and more haywire in one way or another, I felt more and more that my democratic rights, that is to say, to put my voice in, had been taken away, right? Because the leaders of these institutions said, well, the democracy set up these institutions. I mean, it was democratic participation. But now that they exist, we have institutions inside of these institutions. For example, the General Assembly, which represents various countries, or in the EU, the Parliament, the European Parliament. And that is the way we practice democracy. We're not going to ask Mr. Smith and Mr. Jones in, Norfolk, England, or in Berlin their views. Their views are represented by indirect democracy. So think about it for a minute. Our Constitution and so forth is actually set up to work as indirect democracy. We are voting for representatives to represent us, and if we don't like them, we can vote them out. But we don't get to vote on everything. In fact, one of the much criticized aspects of the state of California is that we have these constant propositions, right? Because people in California are saying, oh, the legislature isn't doing what we want them to do. Some cuckoo group and some not so cuckoo group puts in tons of money. These propositions get put on the ballot. Half the people don't know what they are. They don't read them necessarily. So interest groups who are really interested in them get to vote for them, right? And it's a way of bringing direct democracy into the state operations in California. And I think any analysis of that would say that it actually raises more problems than it resolves most of the time. That is to say, there is a reason why you have indirect democracy, because you can make people accountable whose specialization is to worry about the problem, rather than asking us, Mr. Smith and Jones, to all of a sudden be knowledgeable about some technical issue in the Constitution and then having to make a decision while we're not lawyers and we might not even know the issue. Now, I'm exaggerating to make a point. I mean, some propositions seem like a good thing and it's democracy in action, but actually grassroots voting rather than democracy through representation is not necessarily a good thing. Okay. But that is what people are clamoring for worldwide. Why? Because they don't trust the politicians. And in Europe and some other parts of the world, it's not just that they don't trust the politicians, which admittedly often are corrupt, but they also don't trust the bureaucrats. Right? Now, you know, we all love to not like the bureaucrats. I mean, many bureaucrats just shuffle papers. They don't do anything useful. They don't earn their keep. But on the other hand, of course, if you go to that, let's say the health department, they may actually know about health issues and how to fight Zika, while you and I might actually not, right? So for you and I to vote that we should do X or Y about the Zika virus feels good, but it's not necessary. We don't necessarily have the technical knowledge to deal with it. So in a sense, what the whole edifice of global governance and of one kind or another was built on, and globalization assumed, was that you could, through various layers of institutions, the indirect democracy, sometimes no democracy at all, but governing institution, you could keep a system going which reduced the states internally collapsing and also going into conflict with each other. And so in the jargon of political scientists, since the end of the Second World War, the idea was that sovereignty would be redefined. It wouldn't go away, but it would be redefined. The idea of sovereignty, of course, as you know, comes from the idea of sovereign, who purportedly was able to make all decisions for society. Right? That then morphed historically into popular sovereignty, we the people, rather than the king or whatever, right? And then the idea was that you had a kind of a billiard ball state. It had borders, definite borders, and inside those borders, the political forces and the populations were the only ones that could decide issues, okay? As you went into global governance and globalization and global institution building, more and more activities were voluntarily handed by the states to other institutions to make decisions on behalf of the states. That handing over was voluntary. Nobody forced anybody to do it. But once it was done, it really meant that once you had signed a treaty or you became a member of an organization which legislated, it was no longer up to you, the governing people in the state, to make the decision, but rather these other institutions to make the decision. So that began to feel like one step removed. You know, here I'm sitting in Santa Cruz. Who the hell are these people in Geneva making decisions, and my government telling me they have to abide by the decision? You might hear echoes of this from Trump, by the way, because, you know, never mind that we signed this genocide treaty or we're obliged to treat prisoners humanely or anything else. We're the United States. We don't have to adhere to that, says he. That sounds good to a lot of people. That sounds good to a lot of people. Why should somebody else decide? If we want to torture, terrorists, why can't we just torture them? Say our leaders, because we are part of international law, which says we can't do this. We've agreed to that. Well, let's disagree from that. Let's get out from under that and torture people. They're bad. They should be tortured. Right? So you have the disconnect about sovereignty, meaning you can control things inside of the state, but the billiard ball has become frayed because there are all kinds of avenues into that billiard ball which don't make a hard crust anymore because you've signed treaties or become member of an institution. Well, then why can't you just get out from under it? Well, theoretically, of course, you can. I mean, we could vote as a population to leave the United Nations, as England has done to want to leave Brexit, right? That is to say, the population can vote to get out from under these obligations. But is this a good thing? You know, and will this make the world work better? That is really the question of the day. So as everybody is clamoring to say, let's take things back locally, we can do things better locally, there comes the sort of counter-arguments from folks like me who say, wait a second, folks, there is lots about the system that has been erected over 50, 60 years that we all benefit from. okay, and would continue to benefit from. I'm going to get back to economics and specific issues in a minute, but let me flip to a topic which demonstrates what I've just talked about. Arguably, in the next 50 years, the most serious issue confronting the world is climate change. Okay. Climate change can't be done locally. It's got to be done globally. Not only improving the climate prospects has to be done globally, but also developing a system to do it has to be done internationally. We can do all the recycling we want in Santa Cruz, and God knows we should do it. And we should get out of our cars and so forth. It doesn't mean we have no local obligations, but it means that if, Capitola and Aptos don't also do it, the problem can't be resolved, okay? So the argument that you can put the genie back in the bottle, that is to say, you can reduce the globalization and move back into national and local greater control, depends on the topic you look at. Lots of topics you can pull back locally. That is to say, the local, the national, the international, all have to be linked. Which is why, the pro-climate people are saying you need international treaties. Eventually you need treaties where you have to pay a price if you don't adhere to X and Y. At the moment you don't, and so forth. It's, I think, the best large issue standing before us, which demonstrates that taking back sovereignty, taking back national control for 200 different countries, some of which are, 1 billion plus people, and some of which are 20,000 people, little islands somewhere, is not even realistic. It is a harebrained idea, but it's an idea that appeals to people. It's an idea that just simply appeals to people. We should take it back. And it's worse than that. That is to say, it's not just that people are arguing this globalization is really bad, global governments is really bad, what we really need is national control. Lots of people also believe in local, subnational control, so that there are a lot of ethnic groups, whether it's the Catalonians or the thises or the that's, who want independence from the larger state. Now, can you imagine moving from 200 sovereign countries to maybe 400 in this century? Under those circumstances, you would need even more rules unless you want total chaos and more linkages and more institutions. So that's not a particularly good idea. But even when it's not linked to national identities or ethnic groups, it's even linked to locales. There's several of you in here who are Italy experts. So one of the right wing parties in Italy won the mayoral race in Rome, for example. Okay, and it was very much one of these, let's take control, and we can do things better, and the politics of Rome have been corrupt, and so forth and so on. So she has been in power for 3 months. And now there's total chaos in Rome. The garbage is not collected, everybody is objecting, nothing is working, etc. Those of you traveling to Italy soon, you might check it out. But it looks to me, sitting here in Santa Cruz, that it's becoming an utter mess in 3 months. Why is it becoming an utter mess? Not because Rome hasn't had mayors before, but this particular mayor has no previous experience which would allow her to be mayor of a major city in the world. Just like Mr. Trump has no previous experience. And there are lots of those people running around. Now, since I made a derogatory comment about Mr. Trump, let me hasten to say that some of the right-wingers of let's disaggregate from the world, whether it's Marie Le Pen and some others, are actually very savvy politicians and are not ignoramuses at all. And that differentiates us from some of these people. They're savvy politicians who've been in power, who run parties, who know what they're talking about, which you can either say makes it better or makes it a lot worse, because if they get into power, they will really know what to do in terms of turning their societies into the right way. Okay, I seem to be skipping around, but let me just then talk about the global governance in terms of some key issues. One of the key issues right now has to do with trade, right? And the argument is that globalization of trade is a really bad thing, right? And it's a bad thing for many reasons, not least of which it's what makes people unemployed, it is said, right? So everybody and their uncle, including Hillary Clinton, is now against the TPP, which is the trade agreement potentially with Asia, mostly Asia. It may surprise you, maybe somebody could help John back there get a chair. It may surprise you that You okay? Okay. Bad thing. I'm losing audience. One way to get away from me is to hide in the closet. So let me take 5 minutes to make an argument about trade and why it's such a big issue in the global sphere right now. Trade agreements are said to have done us in. That is to say, one of the reasons the economy is so bad is because we have these trade agreements and jobs are going overseas, like NAFTA jobs went to Mexico, etc. And we're really in bad shape, and we certainly don't need more trade agreements. And Bernie Sanders was against trade agreements, so you have right and left and everybody in between being trade agreements. It is true that some trade agreements have aspects to it that are not good. They should be improved and so forth. For example, into trade agreements, there ought to be things about the environment, that the environmental harm isn't done and so forth. And you can make various arguments that industry has moved out of England to somewhere else or out of the US to somewhere else and so forth. But here's the thing. Actually, the problem or the spin-offs of some of the bad trade agreements, supposedly bad trade agreements, have not actually been caused by the trade, but have been caused by technological changes. It's technology rather than trade per se that's the issue here. But even, and you might want to ask some questions about that later, but even without that, I'd like to make an argument for the politics of trade agreements. Because one of the things that trade agreements do is to help not individuals or localities, but societies, countries, states, improve their economies by making it easier to move around, to have the most productive enterprises. And that, in turn, actually stabilizes international politics rather than making mincemeat out of them. So let me give you an illustration. One of the most criticized trade agreements is NAFTA, right? The trade agreement, Canada, United States, and Mexico. And it is true that whole communities in the United States, a factory moved out, and all of those people became unemployed. Okay, and they moved to Mexico where labor was cheaper and so forth. It is also the case, that in recent years, contrary to what Trump says, the net inflow of people from Mexico is identical to the net outflow, more or less. In other words, Mexicans are not streaming over the border at all anymore. Of course, Trump will tell you rapists and this and that and the other thing. But basically, essentially, the movement of Mexico to for people who come to the United States to work has stopped. And one of the reasons it stopped is because the economy in Mexico has gotten better. People don't naturally want to go to other societies. They just as soon stay home with their families and their language and so forth. And one of the things that trade agreements do, if they improve the economy of the less well-off countries, is to make it possible for people to earn a living in the countries in which they live in, which means they don't flock all over the world, which in turn means you don't have the disruption that people are upset about of refugees and everybody moving in. Now, I'm setting aside political refugees, wars, and so forth, but economic refugees. So if you want to argue that you don't want half of Southeast Asia flowing into the United States because they're hoping to work here, one of the best things you can do is to allow Vietnam and Cambodia and all the societies to become more middle class, to become more affluent, so that not only is there a middle class that wants to stay, but poorer people can imagine themselves becoming a middle class and wanting to stay. And the crisis at the moment is that everybody is imagining that, 200 million people will be moving everywhere into industrial countries. And one of the best ways to stop that is to have decent trade agreements to make it possible for people to, in fact, stay in their own country. In other words, what I'm arguing for here is that foreign aid, for whatever it's worth, by and large has not worked. But what does work is allowing economies of countries themselves to flourish. And when they flourish, you not only politically stabilize those countries, but you stabilize them economically and you reduce the flow of people internationally in one fashion or another. You will say, but what about these poor folks in wherever, North Carolina, where the textile factories had gone away? And that is, of course, the rub. The rub is that governments have promised, the United States and others, that they would help re-educate those people and allow them to move into jobs that are now available. And by and large, governments have not made good on that. So the people who are dissatisfied, who are saying, oh, NAFTA did us in, are actually correct. NAFTA did them in. But the reason NAFTA did them in was because the US government, Congress, and so forth refused to do the put in the money for retraining and relocation, which if they had done it, these people would now have a new mode of income. Right? So this gets to be fairly complicated because you have to do both parts of it. You can't just do one side of it. So contrary to what many of you may think about my politics, the fact of the matter is I'm actually an advocate of a decent TPP. And I'm actually an advocate of a decent treaty with Europe, which is unlikely to happen now, just the way TPP may very well not happen in the US, because the politics of Europe, as well as the politics of the United States, says the last thing we want to do is enmesh us even further with these countries and have jobs and whatnot flow out to other societies where the labor is cheaper and so. But I think that's very short-sighted, right? And the impetus for those people who are still arguing for trade agreements are, of course, charged with those are the idle rich, right, who are arguing for that, and it's not the people on the ground who are disadvantaged. But as I said, better policy would help the people that are disadvantaged and might, at the end of the day, 10 years down or 15 years down, be a better situation. The other aspect of the economics of this is something that you've probably all heard about or read about, which was that the European Union told Apple that they needed to pay taxes to Ireland. And that's actually a fascinating thing to unpack because it will show, in a sense, how this all misfires and works. Who the hell says Ireland, and for that matter the United States, is some stupid commissioner from the EU to tell Ireland that it needs to collect taxes from Apple, right? This is exactly the sort of thing we want to get away from, which is why we're going to vote for a right-wing party who's going to stop this nonsense. These stupid bureaucrats in Brussels. Well, the stupid bureaucrats in Brussels say, actually, we don't care what taxes Ireland charges corporations that settle or move their money to Ireland. What we're opposed to is Ireland making special provisions for certain companies and not others. They say we honor the sovereignty of states to determine what taxes should be. But we do not accept the idea that you can tax favorites differently than others, right? So, in fact, Ireland says, well, we don't want the European Commission to tell us what to do, because, of course, we would like corporations to settle here in these phony arrangements they have. Apple's building is empty, by the way, in Ireland, largely. It's just a kind of an office thing to be located there. And move money in, right? And to make it more complicated, so Ireland is against the EU, and Ireland is a member of the EU. And then you have the US being against it, because they figure that if Apple has to pay all these taxes back taxes to Ireland, Apple is less likely to repatriate some of the funds back to the United States, some of the profits, and we, under current law, can only tax profits that get moved back into the US, not that are made overseas. Now, this may sound too arcane for you, but it is, in fact, shows on a really narrow and specific instance how people rail in favor of sovereignty for very different and odd explanations, and don't understand that there are actually some benefits for somebody sort of looking at it all in the interest of everybody rather than the interest of this interest group or that interest group. Okay, they take the next 15 minutes before the break and move to non-economic issues that are circling everywhere. I've already touched on refugees. They're currently somewhere between 65 million and 75 million refugees in the world. They all have to go somewhere. Where are they going to go? It is a huge international problem. 65 million people is larger than has a larger population than most countries in the world. Those are those people roaming around there. We in the United States are, because of our elections, railing against it all and saying, yeah, we'll put in a little money, maybe we'll take another 20,000 people. But it is a scandal what we're not doing in the US in terms of the refugee crisis. We can talk about next time or during question. But the refugee issue is, of course, very destabilizing. And it's destabilizing in many countries, and it's destabilizing the politics, and it is another input into this move to the right, to authoritarian leaders and so forth, who will say we will fix this problem. In most cases, the way countries intend to fix it is simply not to allow more people in and to deport as many people as they possibly can because they don't grant them asylum. And this, too, is very complicated in international law, and I won't bore you with it, but it's worth talking about in some further detail down the line. The Middle East, as you know, is a hopeless mess, and it's not about to get better. And so from an American perspective, talk about next time, it's really what, if anything, should we do about it, or can we do about it, or should we just write it off and say the hell with it all? While we are railing against the Middle East and are arguing on the one hand that, just carpet bomb them all and, stop it, international diplomacy is not working, which indeed it is not, because there's no incentive to have it work, we in the United States are conflicted and confused about it all. The rest of the world is conflicted. The UN is not functioning very well anyway, and it's not functioning properly with respect to the Middle East. But oddly, and I don't mean to focus in on them, Congress, the US government, has just allocated $38 billion of military assistance in the next 10 years to the state of Israel. And congressmen think that should be made higher. That's what the Obama administration said, but they say $38 million billion is not enough. Billion with a B is not enough. Now, if anybody thinks that 10 years down the road, anything in the Middle East is going to be settled under these kinds of circumstances, they're delusional. Absolutely delusional. Because while we are consumed with Syria and we're consumed with Turkey and Iraq and so forth for perfectly good reasons, the fact of the matter is, if anything gets resolved in the Middle East, other local Middle East issues have to get resolved. One of them has to do with the Kurds, another one has to do with the Palestinians, and Israel and so forth. These are not in the headlines nowadays, but they're lurking behind it all. And they're lurking behind the US having a hard time dealing with some of the actors in the Middle East. So while the US writes this all up as, well, of course, Israel is our strongest ally in that part of the world, and we don't care that the government is right-wing and violating people's human rights right now. We criticize it occasionally, but then we criticize Obama for having criticized it. So this is all very murky in American politics right now. But the problem here is that people in the Middle East have very strong views, not only about the US intervention in Iraq originally, but they have strong views about Israel, they have strong views about the Kurds, they have strong views about everything. And ironically, we are rather ignorant of all the kind of specifics of the Middle East and the politics of the Middle East. Now, you can be on one side of these issues or on the other. That's not the issue. The issue is that they're issues. That is to say, they need to be addressed and they have consequences. And you can't just sit in the US and say to yourself, well, you know, my budget is in the hundreds of thousands. I can't even think millions, much less billions. So 38 billion, you know, is probably a good idea. Because, you know, it is a democratic state and it's our ally and so forth. But boy, does this have consequences. And the consequences have to be addressed in some fashion or another. So part of the problem here is that in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, there were all kinds of complicated issues in the world. But the complicated issues in the world are now global. And part of modern technology, part of trade, part of everything means that you can't sort of decide what the US has decided largely throughout its history. You focus in on one or two issues and you relegate everything to the back burner, and you'll get to them when that crisis arises. Because these crises are very much interlinked, and we're slowly learning that in the 90s and moving into the 21st century. And the problem with that for the US, again, I'll talk more about it when I talk about foreign policy, is that we're used to being so far removed from everybody and so untouched largely by everything, that we are, as citizens, not very expertise in any of it, and assume somebody else is, but that's not our highest priority. So the American voter typically lists their priorities as to why they're voting the way they're voting, and foreign policy issues usually are fourth, fifth, sixth, and so forth. They're economic issues, local issues, and so forth. In many parts of the world, because countries are packed so closely, international issues matter. All you ever have to do is talk to your, let's say, children about foreign affairs, and then talk to somebody of the same age somewhere overseas. And I'll swear to you, not only will they speak multiple languages, but they'll know a hell of a lot more than we do, than our children do, than our grandchildren do. So we are in some ways, as an American society, somewhat disabled by assuming that there's some hot spots, we'll attend to those, but we don't have to pay attention to these other things. So the kind of global governance issue having to do with the Middle East is that it is enormously nuanced and complex, and we simply don't understand it. So we wade in, whether it's the, you know, the coup or the unsuccessful coup in Turkey or something else. We sort of see things in black and white. We don't know the history. You know, you read in the newspaper that some Kurds are part of the U.S. for U.S. Opposition, U.S.-supported opposition for Syria, and then the Turks say, no, they're our enemies, so we're bombing them, and we sit and scratch our heads and say, what the hell is going on out there? It is just worth paying more attention to. And because the world has gotten so complicated, it's obviously impossible for everybody to know everything, right? Even the experts are, flummoxed by it. So part of the problem in the Middle East are not just the isolated problems, but the problem in this globalized world is being made so much more complex because the situation in the Middle East is incredibly complex. However, I do want to say that I think that the biggest crisis point in international affairs that are confronted during this election, after this election, are, in the long term, some of the things I just talked about are the most important. But in the short term, the most important issue is none of these. It's North Korea. That is the most dangerous touch point in the world right now. And North Korea is not part of any of this in many ways, but North Korea is the most dangerous place in the world right now, and what to do about North Korea puts the U.S. and everybody else between a rock and a hard place. Nobody knows what to do and how to move the needle, and it is incredibly dangerous because it, in fact, could lead to nuclear war. It, in fact, could hit us directly. We can't just say, oh, the Middle East, it's down there. It doesn't really, affect us directly. It is, we're, all tied in knots about now having lost some power and influence in the world because of the rise of China. Well, the rise of China, yes, the rise of other countries, that's fine. That's okay. Powerful countries play a role in the world. Would we be better off with a weak China in civil conflict and disarray? Of course not. China is a major power. We should recognize this as a major power. We may not like everything that's going on in China. China doesn't like everything that's going on in the U.S. But China is a serious country that needs to be addressed as a serious country, needs to be recognized as a serious country. North Korea is not a serious country. North Korea is like a mini carbuncle there. But it's a mini carbuncle that nobody knows what to do about. And it is the most dangerous thing. And if politicians wing it, as Mr. Trump is doing it, by saying, oh, well, the problem can be resolved. We don't have to deal with China. I don't like China anyway. What we'll do is we'll make sure that Japan and South Korea has nuclear weapons. That's Mr. Trump's solution to the thing. Up until this point. By the next time we meet next time, he might have a different idea. But But the fact of the matter is that neither China nor the United States knows exactly what to do about Korea, because almost everything you do can lead to bad consequences. It really is something that no one has a good idea. I mean, people make suggestions, I can make suggestions, but no one really knows what to do. And it's not just potentially dangerous because down the road they will have missiles that can land in California. It's dangerous in the sense that right next door is South Korea, 20 million people sitting on a few miles away. And that's an ally we're committed to defend, right? So even if they just make local trouble, that's a problem. But even more seriously, I suppose for the long term, if this sort of bops along and continues, I do want to link it with what I have been talking about for the last hour, which is that North Korea is also part of the international technology and trading world. And what they trade is technology, nuclear information, and so forth. So the proliferation that can take place, and is already taking place, into terrorist groups and so forth, it's not pressure cookers that we need to worry about. It is, in fact, nuclear materials that terrorists and so forth can acquire. And where do they get it from? They can get it from North Korea because that's how they make their living, in part, in terms of international trade. So here we have the most isolated country in the world, the most perplexing country in the world, the country with nuclear capacity sitting up there in a very, densely populated part of the world, with prospects of reaching us in the way that the Middle East does not in military terms. And we don't know what to do about it. And at the same time, this isolated and isolationist country, is part of the globalization of trade in the world. And that makes it that much more serious. So that should give us a clue, and it goes back to the beginning of the talk, which is isolating yourself is not only not an option in any rational way having to do with climate change and trade and modern communication and so forth, but even kind of politically isolating yourself is not really an option in a world where everyone, in some way or another, is the potential countries to offer things people want or the recipients of some that either they want or they don't want. And so the intermeshedness of this world is what needs to be addressed rather than the disaggregation of the meshedness. Well, having said that, of course, you immediately got 30 seconds more. That sort of immediately says, okay, Gruhn, fine, you lay out these problems, but what's the fix? And the fix, of course, is that there is no a fix. The fix is that new global institutions have to be built which address 21st century problems rather than 19th century problems. Leaders with genuine ideas rather than just managers need to come into power. And what we really have is a serious paucity in transformational leadership in the world. Because if we had transformational leadership in the world, we could begin to think about these things. But in the absence of that, we're not even thinking long-term by and large. Let's take a break. Okay, guys, having said some random controversial things, fire away. John.
Well, I know you're on.
I couldn't hear.
I know you're going to Spain in a few days.
Yeah.
And I thought while you were there, you might reconsider your, to my mind, very surprising hostile views to the notions that certain areas shouldn't remove themselves from countries. You pointed out one of the crucial problems that we face is that national boundaries do not match the boundaries of groups of people. The Catalonians and the Scots should be free to form their own countries if they wish it. And don't tell me 200 countries, 300 would be awful. We could manage.
Yeah, the question is that I said all these countries splitting up was not a good idea. Having 300 or 400 states, independent states, was not a good idea. And John is questioning that and points out that I'm about to go to Spain, that the Catalonians should be allowed to be independent, and so should Scotland and so forth. Scotland.
You know how much many of the problems in the Middle East are the result of the false national boundaries after.
Right. Okay. Most of the world has false national boundaries because most of the world were colonies and their boundaries were just helter-skelter. And all kinds of people live within those boundaries that don't want to live there and would like independence. Let me unpack that a little bit. The idea in the 50s, 60s, 70s was that economies were economies of scale, and which is one of the reasons why European small countries banded together, and that it was very difficult to run small economies in the modern world. So that was one of the assumptions. The other assumption was that the leaders who took over countries, by and large, had a stake into keeping it intact, because you obviously, if you're going to be a ruler, you'd rather rule over a big place rather than a little place. So the post-independence leaders in the Middle East and so forth all became strongmen in a sense, keeping the thing together rather than allowing it to fall apart. So for people who, like self-determination and who feel that, people ought to be able to do what they want to do, it seems very attractive to say, okay, these are all false countries. We should encourage them if they want to, or at least if they want to, let them fall apart. And, it doesn't matter if we have 400 countries in the world rather than 200. It's an attractive idea. It's also an attractive idea that, maybe California should become independent from the U.S., and we should let Texas become sovereign because we don't like them, and so forth. And certainly Canada should break up because the Quebecois actually, well, he says no, but the Quebecois would like to break up, many of them. So whoever gets it in their mind to break up should be allowed to break up, and then we'll live in a happy world. Well, Nigeria will break up into 20 different countries. The Middle East will break up into 30 or 40 countries. John says, no, it's fewer than that. Let's say they break up into 10, okay? And you have 5 new countries. Are things going to be any better? Rather than, yes, says he. So, why not, right? It gets us back to narrow nationalism. It gets us back to the most narrow identity politics. And if you say those countries are phony, European countries were phony too. They were all phony once upon a time, more or less. They are all political creations. Now, there was no Italy. There was no this, there was no that. They were knitted together. Some of the very people who want to break apart, once upon a time, were already apart, and then they were incorporated in the European nation state. So the question, it seems to me, can be cut in another way, and that is to say that when states were created, that is to say the legal structure of a sovereign state, the idea was that the people inside that state should have a sense of national identity, okay? And the strongest states were thought to be nation states, hyphenated nation states, where people who lived inside the border actually felt that they belonged together, okay? And that is being challenged, and people like John and some of the rest of you saying, well, these challenges have reasons. People speak different languages, whatever. One way to go is to encourage that. The other way to go is to say it's a failure of national leadership, it's a failure of the politics of those countries not to have knitted people together in 50 years' time. Because in 50 years' time, you can create a sense of national identity. And the question is, why do people not have a sense of national identity or didn't develop a sense of national identity? Well, one of the reasons is that the politics and the economics of those countries have favored some people and disfavored other people. So most of the people that want to be apart from other people feel that they've been disadvantaged. The government has not provided them as much resources. They have not gotten as much, decent schooling and so forth. So the fix could either be John's fix. Let's have 400 countries, big deal. Let's have, 50 wars between all those countries, because of course some people will be caught in the wrong border, like the Kurds, right? You can just say, oh, let's give the Kurds independence. Good idea, but the Kurds are sprawled all over the place. Give the Palestinians their independence. Well, could all the Palestinians around the world go back to Palestine? Maybe yes, maybe no. So you can either argue that if people feel uncomfortable in the country they're stuck in, they should be allowed to be independent, Or you could argue that the politics of the state have failed their population into not creating a strong sense of national identity. Now, not having a sense of national identity can actually be exaggerated. Let me take something that I do know something about, like Nigeria, and say, okay, so the Nigerians could split up in multiple states. The Igbos don't think they're Yorubas, they speak different languages, so forth and so on. But they certainly, Nigeria is a fiction of colonialism, right, which is John's point. That fiction of colonialism disappears almost overnight when Nigeria soccer team is playing the Ghanaian soccer team. All of a sudden, people are Ghanaians and Nigerians. And in that, folks like me see the kernel of which direction you could go into. Because that sense of we're different than the Ghanaians can be made to disappear, provided everybody in Nigeria is made to feel Nigerian, rather than being isolated as a discriminated against group. So this particular, I mean, we can argue both sides of the street. I'm willing to argue what I've just said, namely, rather than redesigning the entire world and getting smaller and smaller enclaves of people in the world. I mean, what do you do with a country like India? How many pieces is India going to split up to? I mean, it will be a total mess. As long as John questions that, but anyway, it would be a colossal mess. Go to India sometime and see what it would look like to allow every subgroup in India that speaks a different language to become its independent country. Much better to work on creating a sense of Indianness. And the mistake that people have been making in terms of creating senses of national identity is rather than making things seem fair for every group, they have made things unfair for every group, right, on the one hand. And on the other hand, they haven't honored people's differences. That is to say, people feel threatened when they speak a different language or have a different religion. And that's an ideological thing. You could either decide that, you know, your neighbor who, I don't know, let's say you're American and your neighbor is Chinese or Indian. You could either welcome that as making your neighborhood more interesting, or you could say, you know, who's that person? They're not like me. And so rather than saying to that person from India who lives next door to you, don't you dare keep speaking your language, don't you dare cook your own food, but rather having a welcome, oh, how interesting it is. You can speak your own language as long as you also learn English, because that's a national language, and so forth. So I think actually, in terms of the refugees, the Europeans have the right idea. In some odd way that they don't admit. And that's, they say, is we need to have people learn whatever language we speak in this country as quickly as possible, and to integrate people as quickly as possible, because otherwise we're going to have Turkish cities and Syrian cities and this and that and the other thing. So I think attitudinally, if you are on the one hand make people feel the central government is fair, and on the other hand are willing to honor differences, you can in fact create national identities. And I admit people have done a poor job. And I also admit that maybe some group somewhere that should get their independence. But the idea that, you know, 150 countries will split her into 250 is just going to create more chaos in the world, if you're asking me for my opinion. Yes, ma'am.
No, when you finish.
Yeah, I'm finished.
Okay, I have a question about the TPP. I understand what you're saying about the necessity for trade agreements. However, my understanding is that a lot of this is drafted in secret, and that only a small portion actually deals with trade. A lot of it is protectionism for American corporations.
Yeah, that's right. I think that if, okay, the question is, isn't the case that the TPP was, you know, drafted in secret, and a lot of it is protectionism for American corporations? Both of them are fairly true, and I'm not arguing that this particular version of the TPP is ideal. I am arguing for the general idea that you should have TPPs. I think that, and I don't much want to get into election here, but if Clinton had decided to publicly address what reforms in the TPP she would insist on before signing it, rather than falling into the trap of saying she's now against this, we would all be better off. That is to say, it's just like Obamacare. It has problems with it. They need to be reformed, but you don't necessarily have to be against the idea. You just have to make the thing better. So yes, there are corporate protections in there. It's also the case that we have very few tariffs, right? So actually, for American corporations, it's mostly opening the way in other countries, right? In Vietnam and so forth.
Well, my understanding is that there's a section of it that, for example, when something goes wrong, like a warehouse burns down and the workers are killed, instead of the corporation being responsible for it, the American taxpayers would be responsible. The fact that you've had corporations write the legislation and then you're fast-tracking it so that it's either an up or a down vote, so it can't be altered.
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, the first, she says that Americans would be responsible when corporations mismanage things overseas. For example, you have a fire and the American taxpayers would have to pay for it rather than the local people who are running the factory. And the other part was...
this has been drafted by corporations.
Well,
the
fast track through Congress, namely it can't be amended and so forth. Yeah, you know, I don't disagree with any of that. What I am saying is that the idea of having the TPP is a good idea. The way it was done, it's not true that all of it was drafted by corporations. Corporations were asked to participate and put some things in it. Bernie Sanders kind of whitewashed it and said it's all corporate written, and that's why it's secret. Parts of it, corporations did the drafting, which is true of all trade agreements, by the way, did the drafting. Many parts were drafted by bureaucrats and so forth. Yes, it was drafted in secret. Yes, it's fast-tracked. Now, I'm against the fast-tracking. I'm against the secrecy of it all. The question is, why did that happen? The reason that happened was because Congress votes down anything the Obama administration proposes. I think that if you could have a decent discussion in Congress, Obama would be happy not to fast-track it. But the only way to get it through, as soon as there is a discussion on any bill in Congress, you can count on the fact that it's going to be voted down. And it's going to be voted down because it's Obama's bill, right? So having had 7 years of that, or 6 years, or whenever it came about, he took all kinds of measures which you and I might not think are ideal in order to do it. Well, does it make it any better? I mean, giving the reasons why it happened the way it happened. No, that doesn't make it any better, which is why I am saying that Hillary should have come out there with saying the way this has happened and the way it currently is being pushed through is not a good idea for the following reasons. However, I have had my troops rewrite this thing in such a way, and I want to get it through Congress and have discussion about it, but I'm firmly behind the idea of having a TPP. It's just the way this is structured and being passed, which is not a good idea. That would be a much more forward-looking kind of argument than all of us walking around saying we're against the TPP, because if something resembling the TPP is not passed, I can assure you 100% that all the agreements and trade and so forth in that part of the world will be totally controlled by China, which is not in U.S. interest. We will be locked out entirely. So Obama administration's kind of sense of it is correct, how they proceeded, given the political circumstances, raises problems. That's how I would cut into that. But, you know, people are so anti-China, this, that, and the other thing. China is looking forward to the U.S. not having a TPP, because those small countries will have, and China has developed this infrastructure bank in China, which we stupidly didn't join. And so they are pretty much saying, this is our backyard, we're going to rule all of this. And everybody's going to be economically tied to us. I mean, they'll be economically tied to some extent to China anyway, but more so, okay? So the instinct of a TPP is correct. The specifics, I don't disagree with you. Yes?
How does Russia fit into this whole picture of globalization? Because they don't seem to want to be breaking up, they seem to want to be taking more.
Yeah, I think it's actually, did you hear? How does Russia fit into all of this? They seem to be, rather than withdrawing, they seem to be picking up pieces. Russia is a topic unto itself, and you should have this discussion with Peter Kines. I think he's teaching a course. He's talking about Stalin, but tell him not to just talk about Stalin, talk about Putin as well. Stalin is dead, fortunately. Not to historians, but... So Russia has its interests. Its interests are to be a major player. Its interests are to not be sidelined the way the U.S. has sidelined them in recent years. Russia is very prideful. Putin is a dictator. Putin wants his way. Putin is smarting from the end of the Cold War, having lost out, having lost territory, whatever. His intentions, I think, are largely local. That is to say, to grab back bits and pieces if he can, or control them that's on the border. I don't think Putin has any interest in Africa and in the Middle East. I don't think he has deep interest either. His interests are essentially limited to port and some oil situations, but basically limited to the fact that he wants to be taken as a major actor who has to be consulted of one fashion or another. So, you know, on the one hand, on the other, Putin will throw a monkey wrench into anything the U.S. and the West wants that don't allow him to be a major player. Whatever one thinks of the Soviet Union in terms of its magnitude as a big power, it is a big power if you're talking nuclear and military. It is a very weak economy. And the weak economy is in danger in a way for Russia to sort of allow Russia to implode in some ways. So Putin is very careful to try to manage all of this, and he's going to continue to be in power. I think that probably the best way to deal with Putin is to treat him like he is a major player most of the time, which of course is what Kerry is trying to do in the Middle East. That's not necessarily successful, but a Putin being pushed in a corner is dangerous. A Putin being lurked out of the corner and say, oh, you be a constructive participant and there are actually some benefits for you, is a lot less of a danger. And I'm not don't misunderstand me, I'm not a Putin fan, but I just, yes, go ahead.
You referred, when talking about the trade agreements, to some provisions that weren't enacted, that had to do with retraining. Glad to hear that you say at least thought about it, but...
Well, all governments, all industrial, I didn't say, when I said about, factories going away from small towns and so forth, and I said, retraining would have been the answer. That didn't happen. Would I say more about all of that? Well, all industrial countries that have told their populations that they would do something about people who are left out because of global trade and technology and all the rest of it. And many countries have, in fact, to some extent, attended to it. Germany has attended to it particularly well. When people, during the economic downturn, for example, just to illustrate, when the people would have become unemployed in the US, for example, the German government told the corporations, don't lay off these people. We will contribute half of their salary. You keep them on the other half of their salary, and meantime, put these people into training so that when the economic emergency is over, they will not only still be your workers that you've trained, but they'll even be more trained. That was a very smart way to perceive. What England did, what the US did, and so forth, is to promise that there would be something, some benefits that were given, and then nothing happened, either because their parliaments voted against it, or because ideologically people believed that in economic downturn, what you do is you cut the budget and you don't spend, when in fact any good Keynesian economist would say that's the good time to spend, because if you spend on infrastructure projects and other things, you keep people employed, you give them new skills, and their employment then helps fuel the economy because it puts money, those people's earnings get spent in stores and food and so forth. So the best way in a downturn to keep the economy going is not to start cutting everywhere, but rather to in fact spend some money, which helps you gear up the economy. And we didn't do that, and some other countries would do that. Having said that, we shouldn't exaggerate what is currently going on. Unemployment in this country is very low. Underemployment is higher. Unemployment in England is the lowest in the European Union, in those groups of countries. And I'm not saying it's a good thing. It's a bad thing. Welfare in Europe is better for unemployed people than it's in the United States. That's a secondary thing. But, you know, the opportunity could be used to train up people, not just by training in new factory skills, but imagining what the new economy looks like, getting them more education, giving them computer skills, allowing them to go to technical schools and paying for that. Not private technical schools, who are then corrupt, but, you know, good ones. So there are things you can do, but when they're not done, you leave people in the lurch. And I'm afraid in this country we left people in the lurch, which is why you now have these, you know, New England towns where everybody's on drugs and committing suicide and so forth. I want to just say that the reality that you can document on paper in terms of their circumstances are one thing. But one of the things that's happened, and I think it's happened with social media, is it's also partly psychological. We're all made to feel that we're in bad straits. And if we take stock even of our own lives, right? We're all doing reasonably well here, living in Santa Cruz and so forth. Even we are made to feel that somehow things are not as good as we hoped that they would be. The world is in disarray, maybe our economic circumstances. For those people who are renting, the rents keep going higher. If you have a condominium, the costs keep going up. There are all kinds of things going on. But it's not just the reality of our checkbooks balancing. It's the fact that we're constantly told we're in bad shape. And that's happened in Europe, and it's happening in other parts of the world. When, in fact, objectively, if you were a social worker or an economist, you came along and you say, isn't this family better off than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago? And you say, oh no, you know, my income hasn't risen. Or I don't have money for vacation. And you say, well, why don't you have money for the vacation? You're paying X amount to Comcast, Y to your telephone company. Every kid in your house has these gadgets. They're considered equivalent to must items, like people used to have pots and pans, right? Well, I'm not saying they aren't must items. What I'm saying is people's lifestyle has changed, but we're made to feel bereft. And I think part of good leadership would be to say, yes, we need to do more for people. We need to have, drug treatment programs. We need to do this. We need to do that. But also to stop acting as if, make America great again. Well, what does that mean? We can't go back to the 19th century, right? We can't become the biggest power in the world because there's China and other countries in the world. There is no way of going backwards. And so instead of, sort of making people feel that there's something they can recapture, The psychological attitude really has to be that they can capture something new, not that they can recapture something, but they can capture something new. And there really isn't enough talk about that in most societies, which is led to the alienation and so forth, and which means everybody who comes on the media who says things are bad and they're getting worse and the country is more indebted than ever and trillions and billions and so forth, that needs to be looked at and disaggregated. You know, debt as a part of what size economy, paid over what period, at what interest rate, and so forth. There's just a lot of garbage out there. And because we're so media, struck, we buy it. And people in Europe buy it, and people in the rest of the world buy it. And it's a bad syndrome. It's a syndrome. Yes, sir, back there.
As a result of globalization and movement of manufacturing outside the United States, is it inevitable that our standard of living in the United States will go down? And if so, for how long?
I don't think our standard of living is going to go down. I mean, there are ups and downs in standards of living, but I think it's in fact going to go up. And I think just because factories requiring unskilled labor is moving to countries where unskilled labor is cheap, doesn't mean that we're not going to have lots of industries morphing into skilled labor. I mean, if you know any industry, and you see what has happened in terms of mechanization of that industry, the degree to which, I mean, once upon a time you had people running around the Amazon warehouses collecting the things we buy. Now you have robots running around. Well, somebody's got to make those robots. Somebody has to program those robots. It's not the same high school dropouts who ran around and picking up your shirt and my shoes. It's a different, the industries, even the industries that are like textile industries in the US, which have thrived and have either gone overseas and come back or never left, they are now mechanized industries requiring all kinds of new skill type workers. So I see absolutely no reason why in an information age, technological age, a country that is at the forefront of developing technology, using it, and so forth, can't keep going forward. Now, will our incomes double in the next 10 years in constant dollars? Of course not. But the idea that economies can, in any historical period, keep growing as quickly as the US economy grew after the Second World War is an illusion anyway. Normal economies don't grow that fast. And economists, can point out historical trajectories and so forth. Can the economies continue to grow somewhat? Sure. Could we be satisfied with a 2%, growth and so forth? Yeah, we could be if we weren't talked into the fact that we were falling apart because we don't have a 5% growth rate. That's the problem. Yes?
You mentioned earlier that the U.S. government plans to give $38 billion to Israel over 10 years. I read that was on the condition that Israel buy weapons made by American weapons.
Yeah, almost all U.S. military aid has the condition that all or most of it be purchased in the U.S. And not surprisingly, the arms industry in the U.S. lobbies for more and more money. So the folks that are lobbying that the $38 billion is not enough, that it should be raised, are the Congress people who are paid by the lobby industries from the arms industry because this is good for arms. Now, of course, if you have a flourishing arms industry, it also means employment. Right? So that's the other side of it. And not only does it mean employment, it's the arms industry which very often innovates technological stuff that we then all use and so forth. So it's a double-edged sword. It used to be, at various times, military aid to Israel used to be 70-30. 70% could be in the U.S., 30% could be in Israel manufacturing to help the Israeli arms industry. And Israeli arms industry is a pretty big arms industry because it exports arms to other countries, right? So Israel, And that's not, I'm not saying something derogatory about Israel here. I'm saying if you have an arms industry, you need to produce enough to make it profitable. And the only way, if you're a small country, to make it profitable is to sell it elsewhere. Right? So it's inherent in having an arms industry that your arms industry has to service countries outside yourself. But yes, the arms industry is a big industry, and as you might note, if you want to be cynical about it, the people on the armed services committees of this Congress very often, when they retire, wind up as executives in the arms industry and so forth. Yes, there's a nice back and forth there. This is true. Gentleman in the back.
What you say leads to the question of, are there things we can do to increase our national global capacity for a comfortable national identity integrated with a global identity? And leaving aside the emotional issues of achieving that, cognitively, you would have to be capable of handling multiple interrelating variables, abstract thinking. So it would seem to follow that one thing we can do, almost individually, since we now know quite well that the money we pay to improve our educational system gives the most return in the earliest grades, would be support of early childhood education and preschool education.
Sure, you all heard, right? This was like, no, how to decide. Can you have, a strong national identity and a strong international identity, and how can you do something through early childhood education which gives people a better idea of what the interests are and should be and so forth? I'm not characterizing it quite accurately. But let me say, any society which does not put its money into education nowadays is bound to lose. Because we're the kind of societies we live in, that if you don't plow money early into education and keep plowing in education, the society will fall behind. So that's the first thing. The second thing is having a strong sense of national identity and international identities are not contradictory ideas. And in fact, we had the idea of the jointness of that all after the Second World War, which is why the US favored the UN and other institutions, because we thought that you could be strong countries with strong national identities and at the same time have a global vision about lots of things. Nowadays, that's being called into question. That is to say, the Trumps of this world are arguing, never mind the global stuff they've done is no good whatsoever. Let's, have more narrow national identities. When I said that we are bereft of leadership, that's one of the problems. That is to say, countries like the United States should have leaders that make it plain to the fellow citizens that you can be, a proud American, and America can continue to be at the forefront, and at the same time, you would have input and you would value the international globalization dimensions which are part of it. These are not contradictory ideas. The trouble is that most of the international institutions were founded at a particular historical time for a particular purpose. That is to say, after the Second World War, to A, rebuild the world, and B, move it forward without, as I said earlier in the lecture, without replicating the sort of nationalisms and so forth and so on. And these institutions are now all badly outdated. They're not addressing contemporary problems very well anymore. The UN is, a kind of shadow of what was intended and of itself. Now, mind you, I'm not saying the UN should have become a world government. I don't think world governments are either good or are in the cards. I'm saying it was a useful institution to deal with the international global dimensions of things. Okay, we've had weak UN leadership. The current Secretary General is incredibly weak. The next one to come is probably going to be weak. None of the candidates look like major world figures. We are living in a day and age where we really don't have very good intellectual leadership at national levels and at international levels. I mean, it's pathetic that the strongest person in Europe became Angela Merkel, right? The one country that was not supposed to rise again. And she is not exactly a paragon of creative thinking. All right? And she became the strongest figure in Europe. There is no one running around. The various candidates for US presidency, all of them running, are, you know, mediocre at best for a variety of reasons and are not visionaries of any particular kind. And I don't mean visionaries, let's make America great. I mean people who have it in their brains that you can combine strong states with a recognition that we live in a globalized world, and rather than trying to rail against it or try to destroy it, it has to be managed. And it has to be managed creatively. And when you're dealing with something that constitutes a large group, my 200 countries, John's 400 countries or 500 countries, when you have that many actors, you have to compromise. And you have to honor other people. But compromise and honor other people doesn't mean you wimp out entirely from any kind of forward movement, any kind of ideas and so forth. So, for example, on the environment, it's a good case, climate change, it's a good case in point. You cannot move forward just by local communities doing their own thing. Somewhere it has to be knitted together at a global level. And in any event, we share the oceans and we share the smallest part of our planet is land, right? It's oceans, it's air, it's whatever. That has to be managed collectively. And you have to honor that different countries have different interests, and they have to be somehow knitted together so that people don't feel that they're losers, but that, you know, some countries may need slightly more time to achieve something, or they may need financial help to achieve something, and other countries have more competence and so forth. But in order to do that, you need leadership. I mean, Obama has in some ways, and for that matter, the Chinese have in some ways have exercised leadership. How do you get countries to do something that is not immediately in their national self-interest? To have them understand that long-term it's in their national interest. Sometimes things in the short term are not, you know, in the short term, it would be nice if I could just drive home at 50 miles an hour. I would get there quicker. But in the long term, I know if we all drove 50 miles an hour, we would have lots of accidents. You know? And so we establish some rules, and we establish the rules not to be generous to other people, but because it's in their self-interest. So it's that dynamic that requires some leadership, and it's not either or, it's how to combine the two. Yes?
In this moment of fragility in the world, what do you think the reason is that we have such a paucity of inspirational leadership worldwide?
They've gone to Silicon Valley.
They've gone to Silicon Valley. Yeah, they've gone to Silicon Valley for, I suppose, two reasons. One is that, you know, you can make your millions there and quickly. But it's also that there aren't even any sort of intellectual, emotional payoffs for running around with odd ideas right now. They're not valued. And I think that goes back to that gentleman's point about education and so forth, that the sort of not valuing originality and ideas and so forth, other than in the tech industry and in sort of narrow fields, makes it more difficult. And that, you know, sometimes it just doesn't have an answer. Somebody, you know, some dictator arises out of nowhere, or some leader arises out of nowhere, or somebody is thrust into leadership. I mean, you know, nowadays there are programs on PBS on Churchill and Roosevelt and so forth. These people didn't inherently look like they were going to be major world figures for a long period of their political lives, and they somehow grasped the moment and, you know, stepped into the vacuum or whatever when it was needed. Will such people come along? One hopes so, but in the meantime, what are coming along are demagogues, and that, of course, is the flip side of it, right? Most of these countries now have demagogues coming along, and they appeal to people. So how you can get some leadership, intellectual leadership that is not demagogic is a very good question. I have no answer. Yes?
Can we set you up nationally as a write-in candidate?
Thanks for the compliment, but I don't think I would be any good at it. But speaking of writing candidates, I mean, everybody who's fed up with Clinton and Trump and who thinks that they should vote for the libertarians, think again. I mean, actually, and I guess this is unrelated, but it's an editorial comment. I mean, there aren't very many countries where the people who run for office are quite as ill-informed and stupid as some of the people who run for office in this country. I mean, even the Pens and the Farages of this world are well-educated, smart people. It's just their views that one wants to question. I mean, Mr. Johnson, right? Aleppo? Gee, what's Aleppo? I haven't heard of Aleppo. Well, you can't know everything. When I become president, I'll learn these things. Hopeless.
While we're on topic, maybe consider touching on it. The inequity of wealth in this country, the amount of wealth and small percentage of hands in this country. People aren't talking about that in terms of its political impact and, and how the media plays into that. And that interconnection of how money can buy power and wealth in this country.
A very good question, right? The 1%, the inequities. I didn't touch upon it, and it's a very good place to end on. And that is, it's not just in the U.S., it's global. 85 humans, roughly speaking, in the world own half the assets of 85 people in the world are equivalent to the bottom half of all living humans. I mean, that is startling. That is absolutely startling. And yes, it is the case that one of the things that the tech world and globalization has done is create these incredible inequalities. And unless they're addressed, we're not going anywhere. And the point is that they can be addressed. They need to be addressed globally. They need to be addressed nationally in every country. It is a huge mess, and politicians are unwilling to touch it. They make it sound as if they're touching it. I mean, for example, Trump makes it sound, well, we're going to give more tax, or have more taxes for childcare or whatnot. And then if you look at the specifics, the people that will benefit are, again, the 1 or 2% and not the people on the bottom. And that's happening worldwide. Yes, it absolutely needs to be addressed. And again, you need sort of intellectual leadership to find imaginative ways to address it. Because we Americans in particular sort of feel, well, I'm working very hard. I earn my, $250 million. And, I can just put down $5 million to buy a house in Santa Cruz. I don't even have to take a mortgage loan, right? While the school teacher here can't find a rental and can hardly make ends meet. It's particularly stark, of course, in the U.S. because the U.S. used to not be that kind of society, right? So, yes, that's high on the agenda. But even there, you're going to need intellectual leadership. Just screaming isn't going to do it. And you don't have the leadership of people imaginatively saying, this can't work. You don't want to punish the people in Silicon Valley because they are creative and they're contributing to our lives. But they don't have to become one of the 1%. And the other bad part about it is that now in the U.S., it has become fashionable to say, okay, well, they can make their billions, but then they'll set up foundations and distribute the money. Well, that doesn't work really well in a democracy. We should have good health research, medical research, and not be dependent on charity. I mean, we've had the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and so forth, and there's nothing wrong with having foundations. But they should not, the public realm needs to address these issues. And it's part I'm sorry I had neglected it, but yes, it's a key issue. I should liberate you guys because it's after 12. I'll see you on October 18th.